Now, we haven't really talked about the dates, and I want to show you some great features that we have when you add dates to your pivot table. When I started this lesson on pivot tables, I said the pivot tables were a great way to create a summary without having to enter any formulas at all. But sometimes, because my data is based on transactional data, I'm actually seeing daily dates going all the way down. In this particular data set, we have fields for revenue, very tedious report, and I can't imagine any VP level. What if we needed to calculate a gross VP of manufacturing? That's profit divided by revenue sold every day. What's possible to add a brand new monthly, quarterly, to our pivot table field list using fantastic feature in pivot tables. Now let's restructure our pivot table. I'm going to take this new customer to field to a monthly report from the pivot table report. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to add the first thing you have to do is select one of the cells that contains. Currently, the report just has revenue. I'm going to choose the options tab of the ribbon. Some values column. Because we have a date. All right, now we want to add a new formula to our pivot table. Field icon. The formulas are controlled on the options tab of the ribbon on the using the formulas dropdown. Because our selection contains a date, we automatically add a calculated field dialog and a calculated item. A calculated field adds a brand new field to the pivot table field list, and that's what we want to do in this case. One very important thing to realize is you never want to group. And Excel shows me all of the fields that are available January in the pivot table field and January of last year. First, I'm going to give this field a name, perhaps a name like profit percent. While that's great for seasonality analysis, it's probably not. Then I have to build the formula. Initially, the formula starts out with equals 0. I need to get rid of the 0, so I'm going to click to the right of the 0 you should notice. Hit the backspace First of all, the date field, to get rid of the 0. Which used to contain daily dates. Now, my formula here is pretty simple. It's over in our pivot table divided by revenue. We have a brand new I can click on the profit field and then click on Insert Years. Next, I want to type 500 rows. This is just like building Excel formulas. The slash is used for showing revenue by year. And then I want to insert the revenue field. One cool thing is now, instead of clicking on revenue and then insert field, let me take the simply double click the revenue field. There I have a new field called profit percent, and the row label is profit divided by revenue. This allows me to create a report that compares January and this year. The new field is automatically added to my pivot table. This is a very popular report. It'd be really nice if I could format that field as a percentage. If I select one cell in the website, MrExcel.com, and then use the right there in the settings button, and I tend to get questions from all over the world. I remember one day I was driving in the corner of this dialog from Mexico, the number format button. He says, "Hey, I read about grouping fields. Choose on your website, and I need to group by weeks, percentage, and as I'm trying to picture back to that dialog would probably be appropriate." I'm thinking, I said, "Well, I know that there's days, months, quarters, years. Excel has now added a new virtual field to our data set. There is that's a formula that is a new pivot field. Go back to the fields are very useful. I find all sorts of occasions where I can use them. Years and months. The other type of formula is a pivot item and select days. I need to warn you that pivot items days is very dangerous if you don't understand how they work. The number of days also a very specific now becomes enabled. You cannot create a calculated item. We need to spin that up to say that we have any group by 7 days in the pivot table. Now we've already grouped customer 2 and we've grouped years. You then need to grab the calendar on the wall is to delete the pivot table. What day of the week? January 2nd, 2007. So I'm going to delete sheet 7. I'm going to right click on the sheet tab Tuesday and choose delete. And if you want your weeks to start on Sunday or Monday, you need to adjust that value. We're back to our original data set. I'm going to create a pivot table again very quickly. Remember, we choose so that way our weeks start on Monday. And then pivot table. When I click OK, I have the somewhat strange view. Now we have a fresh shows me the start date. I'm going to add the region of each week down the left-hand side. However, it's a great way to summarize your data, showing weekly data, even though the dialog revenue in the sum value weeks. Now, so if you happen to be that guy who called me from Mexico and I gave you the wrong answer, I really apologize. The central and now there's one gotcha. We want to create a new item along the region field. Once you group by week, you're not allowed to group by anything else anywhere else. Take a look at the total revenue in cell B7. Cool feature, but it has this huge limitation of revenue. If you desperately need to group by weeks, go ahead and do that. Just be aware that once you group by one cell, you won't be able to group anything else in the pivot table. Because of that, I need to go back. And now when I go to the formulas drop-down, calculated item is a valid value. I'm going to create a new formula. Date fields. It's also possible to give the formula a name. Let me show you how. And type a formula. I'm going to take my dates and years off of the pivot Central plus North and add customers on. Click OK. Now you see what's happened. I'd like to sort the customers a brand new item by customer name, so I'll go back to my customer new VP. And it happens that 8.3 million is the 4.6 million plus. Now let's say that we're in an accounting department. However, and they've added that total and our company is now a $21 million company for everything instead of a $13 million. And we'd like to create a group. Very, very frustrating the way that this works. Select the only way that this would ever make sense in that range is if we would remove the central and north from regions from the pivot table entirely. And choose group selection. I now have a new field called Group 1 North that includes all of those customers. Now we're back to 13.2 You'll notice that Excel has created a bunch of new groups for all the other customers. I need to go through and very, very careful that you don't accidentally leave the source items and the calculated item along the same for everything from I through R. Choose those customers and group selection. choose the remaining customers, and choose Group Selection. Scroll back up to see the top of the report. Now you notice that we have a brand new field called Customer 2. This is a virtual field that we just added to our pivot table. We could very easily take the customer field off and just show the sales by group. There you have it. Excel offers many different options for grouping. Dates, obviously, is the one that gets grouped the most often, but it's possible to take text entries and group them into logical groups using the group selection option. When I started this lesson on pivot tables, I said that pivot tables were a great way to create a summary without having to enter any formulas at all. But sometimes you're going to need to create a formula in order to make your pivot table do something else. In this particular data set, we have fields for revenue, cost of goods sold, profit, quantity. What if we needed to calculate a gross profit percent? That's profit divided by revenue. Well, it's possible to add a brand new field to our pivot table field list using a formula. Now let's restructure our pivot table a little bit. I'm going to take this new Customer 2 field and remove it from the pivot table report. I'm going to add the customer field along the left-hand side. Currently, the report just has revenue. I'm going to add profit as a second sum values column. All right, now we want to add a new formula to our pivot table. The formulas are controlled on the Options tab of the ribbon using the Formulas dropdown. There are two kinds of formulas that you can add, a calculated field and a calculated item. A calculated field adds a brand new field to the pivot table field list, and that's what we want to do in this case. So I choose calculated field, and Excel shows me all of the fields that are available in the pivot table field list. First, I'm going to give this field a name, perhaps a name like profit percent, and then I have to build the formula. Initially, the formula starts out with equals 0. I need to get rid of the 0, so I'm going to click to the right of the 0 and hit the backspace key to get rid of the 0. Now my formula here is pretty simple. It's profit divided by revenue. I can click on the profit field and then click on Insert field. Next, I want to type the divide sign. This is just like building Excel formulas. The slash is used for divide. And then I want to insert the revenue field. Now, instead of clicking on revenue and then insert field, you can simply double-click the revenue field. There I have a new field called profit percent. It is profit divided by revenue. I'll click OK. And the new field is automatically added to my pivot table. It'd be really nice if I could format that field as a percentage. If I select one cell in the field and then use the Field Settings button in the ribbon. In the lower left-hand corner of this dialog is the Number Format button. Choose the number format that you need. In this case, percentage with either 0 or 1 decimal places would probably be appropriate. Excel has now added a new virtual field to our data set. That's a formula that is a new pivot field. Pivot fields are very useful. I find all sorts of occasions where I can use them. The other type of formula is a pivot item. And I need to warn you that pivot items can be very dangerous if you don't understand how they work. There's also a very specific limitation. You cannot create a calculated item if you have any grouped fields in the pivot table. Now we've already grouped Customer 2 and we've grouped years. The best thing to do at this point is to delete the pivot table and start over. So I'm going to delete Sheet 1. I'm going to right-click on the Sheet tab and choose Delete. We're back to our original data set. I'm going to create a pivot table again very quickly. Remember, we choose Insert and then Pivot Table. Click OK. And now we have a fresh pivot table. I'm going to add the region is down the left-hand side. And revenue in the sum values. Now let's say that in our company there was just a reorg, and there's now a vice president in charge of the central and north regions. We want to create a new item along the region field that will sum those two regions up. I want you to take a look at the total revenue in cell B7. We have $13.2 million of revenue. In order to create a calculated item, I need to choose one cell along the region field. Choose Central, and now when I go to the Formulas dropdown, calculated item is a valid value. I'm going to create a new formula, give the formula a name, and type a formula of Central plus North. Click OK. Now you see what's happened. Microsoft has added a brand new item along the region dimension, new VP, and it happens that that 8.3 million is the 4.6 million plus 3.6 million. However, they've added that total, and our company is now a $21 million company instead of a $13 million company. Very, very frustrating the way that this works. The only way that this would ever make sense is if we would remove the central and north regions from the pivot table entirely. Deselect central, north, and now we're back to 13.2 million. If you use calculated items, please be very, very careful that you don't accidentally leave the source items and the calculated item along the same dimension. Now, instead of calculated items or calculated fields, we can also just change the calculation that Excel is giving us in the pivot table. As an example, I'm going to remove the region field and add the customer and product field. I want customers going down the side. I want products going across the top, so I'll drag those to the column labels. Now, you'll notice that in cell A3 it says that we're looking at the sum of revenue. Every pivot table that we've created so far in this lesson has been showing us the sum of revenue. It turns out that we have control over that calculation. You need to select one cell that contains revenue and then choose the Field Settings button in the ribbon. You'll notice that we have choices here to show a sum, a count, an average, max, min, product. There's also standard deviation and variance if you would scroll down. Another very interesting option is on the Show Values As tab. Right now, Excel is showing us the values as normal. There are several options in that drop-down, including percentage of row. Click OK. In this case, Excel will replace our revenue numbers with percentages that total across to 100%. This allows you, for any particular customer, to see what percentage of product mix they buy. Other settings in Field Settings include percentage of column. In this case, for each product, for example, B713 in column C, you can see which customers buy a certain percentage of that product. These calculations will total to 100% along the bottom. I'm going to remove customer from the pivot table and put date along the left-hand side. Go back into Field Settings and change to Running Total In. I want to show a running total in the date field. And now instead of percentages, I'll see cumulative year-to-date figures. We've created a really powerful report here, but my favorite feature of pivot tables is still to come. This feature will allow us to create one pivot table and then replicate it for every customer or department or any other field in our table. I'm going to take the customer field and move it to the Report Filter section of the pivot table. Now initially, using the report filter, we can show one customer, click OK, and then print. Show the next customer, and then print. Show the next customer, and then print. This could be a very tedious process if we had 50 or 500 customers. Excel offers a great option to allow us to create 50 different versions of this pivot table in a matter of seconds. Now, before we do this, you should think about if you're going to print the pivot table, you would want to go in and create your print settings. For example, landscape, portrait, margins, because very soon you're about to have 50 different worksheets, and you don't want to have to go change those page setup options on all 50 worksheets. So we have our pivot table. We have at least one field in the report filter section, and we're going to go to the options drop-down, where we'll find this setting for Show Report Filter Pages. Choose that. Excel shows you a list of all the fields that are in the report filter section. In this case, we only have one. Click OK. In a matter of seconds, Excel has created a new worksheet for all of our customers. This is a very powerful way to create a report for all of the customers in the data set. Next, I want to show you an example of a data set that has no numeric fields whatsoever, but we can still summarize it with a pivot table. We need to close this file, so use File Close. And then I'll open the file for O2 pivot tables. Now this data set has defect data. It shows the date, the manufacturing line number, and the area where the defect was found. And we want to do an analysis to see which areas have the most defects. Unfortunately, there's no field for us to sum. I'll select one cell in the data, use Insert, Pivot Table, click OK. I want to do an analysis by which defects occurred most often. If I choose the defect field, it's automatically added as a row label. I now need to take the defect field and drag a second occurrence into the sum values. Because this field is text and there's no way to sum, Excel will automatically choose to count, which is perfect. That's exactly what I want. Now, as I look down through the data, I see that Fit and Finish Roof had the most defects of all. So I want to be able to zoom in and take a look at fit and finish roof. Of course, it makes sense to take the defect field from row labels and move it up to report filter, where we can choose fit and finish roof. Let's do an analysis by date to see if this problem has been happening all month. And now instead of percentages, I'll see cumulative year-to-date figures. You'll see that for most of the month, there were just a few occurrences each day. If I scroll down, though, something happened around the 28th of the month. Let's take a look at the lines. I'm going to take the line field and add that to the column labels. The problem seems to have happened first on line 2 in column C. That's the line that started having problems. Using this pivot table, it was very easy for us to zoom in and realize that the fit and finish roof first happened on line 2 and then spread to the other lines a couple of days later. I bet if we check the records, we'll see that a new shipment arrived from the vendor, was restocked to line 2, and then eventually out to the other lines. This is a very interesting situation where we had many rows of defect data, really no idea what's going on, but by using a pivot table and the count option instead of summing, we're able to zoom in and find the problem very, very quickly. Now, so far in this lesson, we've always talked about pivot tables. Pivot tables are a very powerful feature, and for a few features of Excel, we've had a pivot chart. Pivot charts in Excel 2003, though, were really kind of clunky. They didn't work very well. Let me show you how they've improved in Excel 2007. Once we have a pivot table, we can convert it to a pivot chart simply by clicking the pivot chart icon in the Options ribbon. We can choose what type of chart we'd like to see. I'm going to choose the stacked column chart, the second thumbnail in the Insert Chart dialog. Click OK, and Excel draws a default pivot table. We have dates going along the bottom, and then you can see the defects that popped up on the 28th, 29th, and 30th of the month. This is a great visual view that the red line, line number 2, started having problems earlier than the other lines, but eventually on the last day of the month, you can see the purple and green became substantial. Now, what's fascinating about the pivot table is that we can change the value in the report filter. If I click the filter button at the right-hand side of the report filter dropdown, I can show all, click OK. There's an analysis of all of our defects, or I can choose any other specific defect, for example, air conditioning failure. You'll see that these were relatively constant throughout the month, but there was something around the 20th or the 21st where those numbers spiked up. The pivot chart filter pane can tend to get in the way. Feel free to drag that out of the way so you can see the entire pivot chart. If you would like to change the pivot chart to a different type of chart, for example, a line chart or an area chart, that's easy to do using the Change Chart Type icon in the ribbon. I'll choose a stacked area chart. Click OK, and we have a completely different view of our data. Of course, all of the charting formatting options that we'll discuss in another lesson are available here in Pivot Charts. While pivot charts were fairly hard to use in old versions of Excel, check them out in Excel 2007. They've come a long way and are very, very useful.